Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Gavin Nascimento. First, a few announcements. Watch the Forbidden documentary Occult Louisiana on Tubi and other streaming platforms. If you'd like to be a part of our upcoming film project, Doors of Perception, we're going to be traveling to Utah this summer to finish up filming, and we're having a fundraiser to help with equipment and travel expenses. If you'd like to help with the donation, you can use the links in the description or visit supportfkn.com. If you'd like to help in any other way, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. You can also get a Rokfin premium membership. Go to rokfin.com/FKN Plus. You'll get access to all our premium content and all the premium content from every creator on Rokfin. You can also go and download our episodes directly through Spreaker. This is our podcast provider. This is always free for you. We have links for that in the description. Finally, booking guests for June. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome Gavin Nascimento. He is a philosopher, published author, investigative journalist, public speaker, and longtime activist that has developed an international reputation for his meticulous attention to detail, high standard for research, and the ability to communicate complex topics in an easy way to understand. Gavin, welcome. How you doing?
Good, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Today, we're going to once again expose the globalist Zionist plot for global domination and depopulation with some historical info surrounding the events of World War II and the powerful groups that are still attempting to roll out these nefarious plots. And Gavin, you wrote a book recently, A History of Elitism, World Government, and Population Control, which sums up a lot of this information, and we're going to get into that as well. Before we do, this is your first time on. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what triggered your awakening.
Okay, cool. So if there's one thing that's even more complex than my research, it's actually my personal story. So I'm going to try not to get too entangled in that.
Take your time.
But I'm, yeah. So I'm originally from South Africa, and then I moved to the US when I was about 14 years old. I'm actually currently living in the Philippines, so I've been living all over the planet. And whilst I was in the US, that's when I kind of underwent this process. I don't want to say it was kind of an aha moment where it happened just in one particular event alone, because I've always kind of come from the other side of life, which is to say I was raised around bikers and outlaws and those kinds of people. And so naturally, when you born into a world like that, you start off with a viewpoints and a perspective that's very different from most people. And I think really what started to take place later on in my life, because I was actually confronted with a very personal dilemma in the form of an identity crisis. This is actually something that can often confront people who move into a brand new culture where you kind of stripped away of the introductory concepts of human identity or what you think to be. You know, these very frivolous, kind of superficial things. Oh, it's your skin color. Oh, it's your race. It's the local culture you were kind of born into. And then that requires you to dig a little bit deeper. And I myself found myself in a position, not just exclusively the result of coming from a different culture, but coming from a pretty crazy childhood and upbringing where only later on certain things used to would manifest in the form of PTSD, trauma, you know, all these kind of things that can get unconsciously repressed. And I was forced to confront that. And the way I was forced to confront that is in the form of I was feeling like genuinely suicidal. And then I was in a position where I said, you know, either that's the route I'm going to take because I was plagued by anxiety. At the time, I was actually an alcoholic to kind of self medicate. Either I'm going to go the path, the most extreme path, which is suicide. And people engage in this path based on ignorance, a lack of awareness of alternatives. And it's simply because they're trying to, just like anybody else, trying to choose a path where it's not one embedded in suffering and it's an irrational choice, but it's one that's geared towards trying to find some kind of relief or happiness. And so I did something very radical that I had never done before, which was I started to read books.
Hmm.
I was one of those people who had this very narrow-minded viewpoint that, oh, I'm street smart. That's all that matters. You just street smart is better than book smart. But the reality is that you need to be more holistic in your approach. You need to have a book smart view of the world. And once you do begin to open up books, it is a game changer because then you start to broaden your awareness, you broaden your knowledge. And as you broaden your awareness and your knowledge, then you broaden your understanding that there are more opportunities that can create positive change in your life. And once it happened for me on the individual level, that I fully recognize this can apply to others on the collective level. And without dragging it on too long, that was essentially the beginning of my journey down the proverbial rabbit hole. It started off primarily as motivation. And then, of course, as you dig deeper and deeper, you begin to become aware that there is this unprecedented system that, in fact, invests astronomical amounts of energy and unimaginable resources into keeping us disempowered, in keeping us anxious, in keeping us depressed, and so on and so forth. And unless you address that, you can never truly be free.
Great introduction, 100%. Now, what brought you to the book, and give us a synopsis of it?
Yeah, so the book was actually never intended to be a book.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I produced in digital uh, form. Is first of all, I'm a fan of physical publications, right? So I'm a big fan of books. I have a huge amount of books that are kind of just sitting there because where people have or window shoppers for clothes, I'm a window shopper for books. I want that book. I need that book, and then it just sits there. I've got so many that I need to read. But for myself specifically, what happened was I saw correspondences, major correspondences between what had taken place during the so-called Cold War and MK Ultra and what is transpiring in real time or what was transpiring during like the so-called pandemic. And it just began to snowball from there. One thing led to another. A simple blog became a really meticulous ebook. And I never changed the digital format for two specific reasons. The one is there are hundreds and hundreds of sources and citations, and I include videos that I originally made. So that's the one part. And the second part is what we are currently engaged in is a digital warfare. So I want the publication to serve as a sort of digital weapons cache for people that are embedded deeply in research. It is a gold mine of resources and information that, for example, I have a buddy of mine. He recently interviewed me actually, where we did kind of this Zionist Nazi connection, the overlap. And he uses it specifically in that regard. So he constantly goes back, he finds information because there'll be one sentence, there's whatever, there's hundreds of paragraphs, but within each sentence, I'll have a newspaper clipping, an archive, and then some mind-blowing information that people can then go ahead and in real time, you can upload that, you can make a post out of it, and you can get some major traction and rely on incontrovertible evidence, right? That's very significant. When you are confronted with insidious deception, the only formidable defense against that is insurmountable truth. And far too often, people have a very insipid foundation for the arguments that they make, not recognizing that when we are fighting this information war, you have to come with mountainous evidence, like strong evidence. And that's the only way you're really going to shut down shit. Otherwise, you're put in a position where you actually may be part of the problem rather than the solution on an unconscious level.
Excellent. Your book focuses on different areas of our history that were key to the agendas and the situation that we find ourselves in now. Tell us a little bit about where we should start. Your talking points, you have some information about World War II.
You know, I think probably the best place to start in relation to so many different topics. So World War II depopulation, population control, the weaponization of environmentalism, family planning. It all has its roots in something called eugenics. Eugenics, of course, is a subsidiary of the greater ideology of elitism. But eugenics, to try to keep it short and sweet, unfortunately, this has been prepackaged in a very specious kind of a way, which is to say, it gets presented in a very oversimplified quarter truth. It's not even a half truth, it's a quarter truth, which is that this is simply about white supremacy. And that's a gross oversimplification. So, to give a quick summation, eugenics initially, because it's gone through different evolutionary processes, but eugenics initially was the pseudoscience that some people, of course, this is subject to interpretation, that some people are genetically superior to others. And naturally, the so-called elite class, the elitist, the parasite class, they made this their personal crusade. Now, the founding father of this is a guy by the name of Sir Francis Galton. He was Charles Darwin's cousin and very close friend. And he is considered the father of this. And his whole notion is that there's an actual war taking place between those who are less than genetically and those who are then superior. Now, this dude was inbred. Him and the Wedgwood family and the Darwin family, very infamously inbred, but they consider themselves to be superior, which is why they are doing so good in society. Whereas everybody else that is struggling and so on and so forth, the overriding reason is simply that they are genetically inferior. Now, these ideas were then transplanted into the United States. And in the US, they took on a totally different life of their own, where they were adopted by the most powerful people in the world, most notably John D. Rockefeller, and specifically John D. Rockefeller Jr., Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, some of the biggest names you can imagine. And then E.H. Harriman's widow, she was also prolific in this. And so the first actual experiments, believe it or not, because of course this began to give life to the notion of scientific racism. And this was a very powerful movement. So, for example, long before Hitler rose to power, there were eugenics laws. So, laws that allowed the so called parasite class, the ruling class, the elitist class, to sterilize people against their will. And this was in a majority of states in the US. This was before Hitler actually rose to power. And these powerful families, these powerful individuals, their first targets were actually poor white people. And so they produced these pseudoscientific studies that basically gave them a green light to start initiating the passage of laws. The first one, I think, was in 1907, where they can sterilize people against their will. And the thing is, this is a genocidal ideology. It's obviously more innocuous, it's more inconspicuous, it's more sophisticated. And whilst it sounds absolutely crazy to us today, back then, eugenics was in fact facilitated through the facade of something very similar to that of the so-called pandemic, which is to say that the most prominent scientists, the most prominent presidents, prime ministers, highly influential figures from every single walk of life were proponents of this. Okay, there's a score of Nobel Prize winners that were virulent eugenists. And so they used their pseudoscience to start to designate and qualify people as having the diagnosis, for example, of being feeble minded. So there was a very infamous example that people can go check out for themselves of a woman, a young, well, she was a girl really, named Carrie Buck. And Carrie Buck was raped by the nephew of a prominent family. And so they couldn't handle that their nephew raped this feeble minded girl and they blamed her. And as a result of this, she was checked into a mental institution. She was sterilized. They took her baby away from her. And her child ended up having to serve this family later on in life. Now, where Nazi Germany comes into all of this, because it may be seeming like, Gavin, what's this got to do with the price of oil, right? Where Nazi Germany comes into this is Hitler and the Nazis were in fact inspired. So underlying Nazism, we've been very much misled in our interpretation of the objective reality surrounding what Nazism was about, and also World War II. Nazism was rooted in eugenics. So almost every element of Hitler and the Nazis' ideology was imprinted on them within the US. So there was a guy, for example, by the name of Madison Grant. Madison Grant was very close to all of these powerful families, most notably John D. Rockefeller Jr. They funded him heavily, and he produced a publication called The Passing of the Great Race. This is where the concept that the Nordic people, blonde hair, blue eyes, are superior. Hitler became aware of this book, and he later came to refer to it, in fact, as, and I quote, my Bible. And so he began to research this work. He began to follow it very closely. And then there was another individual that was a seminal influence on him by the name of Eugene Fisher, Professor Eugene Fisher.
Hello, friends. Have you tried what may be the most powerful antioxidant known to man? C60 PurplePower. My C60 story has led me to great health mentally and physically. It's helped me personally lose weight, have more energy, and fight aging in general. You can also get C60 for your pets. Our dogs love it. They may live forever. Go check out C60 for yourself. If you use the link right in the description, you're going to get 10% off your order plus free shipping. They have some incredible new products like gummies, oils, and much more.
Eugene Fisher was a German racial scientist, right? They had social hygiene. They had all these kind of duplicitous terms about eugenics. And he served as kind of the intellectual justification to provide legal justification behind sterilizing people. So sterilizing the Jews, sterilizing the Gypsies, and it was also highly selective even within the Jewish community. So some Jews were given a pass. The Ashkenazi Jews, such as Otto Heinrich Warburg of the powerful Warburg family. And so Eugene Fisher was also heavily financed by the Rockefeller network and influence. In fact, if you look into the research, and this is very, very interesting, eugenics itself, the scientific establishment within Germany early on, and you can look at the earliest authority, I know of this, not a controversial guy, renowned international academic, Professor Stefan Kuhl, in his book, I think was the Nazi Connection, if I recall correctly. As he noted, and subsequent scholars have echoed, the key guiding force in eugenics within Germany was the Rockefeller Foundation. So during this time, Germany obviously had a Great Depression. They were hurting for funds, and that included the scientific community. This was a result, of course, of the First World War. And so they injected funds into the scientific establishment in a massive way with the stipulation that it moved in the direction of eugenics. The significance of this is this culminated in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which the Rockefeller Foundation bankrolled in many ways, and the rise of, and this was the heart of the Nazi sterilization program. And this is how it began. The final solution is recognized as being final because it wasn't the primary solution. The primary solution was sterilization and deportation. So anyways, this ideology of eugenics then got transplanted into Nazi Germany. And the significance is not only ideologically was it inspired over there, but financially during World War II and leading up to World War II. The same network, specifically again, the Rockefeller family, through Standard Oil, through the Chase Manhattan Bank, who their uncle Winthrop Waldridge, who was the son of Nelson Aldrich, he was the chair of that, and the Rockefeller family were the largest shareholders. And then also through other organizations, less one known, but it was seminal, was the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation, in which Standard Oil and DuPont, so the DuPont family also played a role in this, and many others, the Ford Company, General Motors. And to make a long story short, and then you can ask me questions accordingly, they began to prop Hitler and Nazi Germany up. They, in fact, gave him the technological transfers, the information, the know-how, the gasoline, the weaponry. And as Professor Anthony Sutton notes, and I wholeheartedly agree, without this patronage, without this support, Hitler and Nazi Germany would never have existed. World War II would likely have never even taken place. And then the greater significance, before I hand over the proverbial mic, is in the wake of World War II, the excuse of Nazi Germany, the excuse of Hitler, was used as a justification to create the first truly global governing structures as personified in the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, a little bit later, but also coinciding, since the same organizational framework was behind all of it, which was the Rockefeller Network and the Council on Foreign Relations. So all of these organizations, Standard Oil and these different corporations, all of the heads of these groups were operating under the Council on Foreign Relations, that think tank. And then the Council on Foreign Relations simultaneously was advising the US government, not just on wartime policy, during something called the War and Peace Studies Group. It was highly secretive back then. You can go look it up on Wikipedia now. But they also advised on post-war policy, and they are the ones. They were the real brains behind the United Nations, behind the International Monetary Fund, behind the World Bank. And then they were also the main brains behind the passage of the National Security Act of 1947. And this is what created the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and essentially what has given birth to this kind of global empire, military empire, right? But we know there's about 800 military bases all around the world. So when you take all of this holistically, and you recognize that Nazi Germany was built up by members of the CFR, and then at the same time, they created these international governing structures as well in the wake of World War II, since they guided it, they literally gave the policy instructions to the US government. And then one last thing, in the wake, they absolved some of the most prolific Nazi war criminals of their crimes through, of course, Operation Paperclip that we know about. And then, but to a lesser extent, Council on Foreign Relations member and future chair, John J. McCloy, who was the High Commissioner to Germany, he absolved many of these high-profile criminals of wrongdoing, and many of them, because a few people know this, but IG Farben, which is the heart of Nazi Germany, right? It was a pharmaceutical / chemical company. They were a conglomerate of different other pharmaceutical and chemical companies, which was BASF, which was Bayer. And these organizations are still in existence today. And the Nazi war criminals, which it's mind-blowing, but as soon as being absolved of their crimes, they went right back to leadership positions within these companies, continue to work there today. And then in the modern sense, we are now faced with a fertility crisis, as the renowned epidemiologist Professor Shauna Swan points out. And guess who the primary culprit she points out? Not only is it the chemicals, but it's specifically companies like BASF and Bayer. So what I see is a continuation of eugenics. World government was created through this platform. And in fact, if you look at a guy by the name of Carlos Patton Blacker, he had a correspondence with a woman named Dorothy Brush, prominent member of Planned Parenthood. He was the general secretary of the British Eugenics Society and later a founding member of International Planned Parenthood Federation. Once eugenics was discovered, when people became disillusioned, very much like how we became disillusioned about the so-called pandemic, right? So many of us, not everybody, but a very large demographic said, wow, this was pseudoscientific, this was crazy, this was bullshit. Something very similar happened with eugenics, where they said, wow, this is the true face of eugenics. This was the extreme expression in Nazi Germany. And then as a result of that, Carlos Patton Blacker, in this letter, it was 1953. You can find it in the archive at a Wellcome Trust. I've made, in fact, a video about this that people can go check out. He spoke about how they had this very calculated plan to engage in something known as crypto-eugenics. And this is when all of these different figures within the eugenics movement began to weaponize environmentalism, weaponize family planning, in fact, weaponize biology, and all of these various fields, which have culminated in their further weaponization and obsession, like in environmentalism, overpopulation, or the Gates Foundation. Oh, I'm helping the world, but it's about population control. So eugenics is the underlying thread of all of it. And with that said, I will go ahead and pass the mic.
Excellent. This is great information. There seems to have been certain major stepping stones throughout our history that led to the operations that are unfolding right now. World War II, the assassination of JFK, 9/11, COVID, and now what are we going to see? A major conflict with Israel. I don't know. I'm going to get your thoughts into that and the state of Israel, how it ties back to Nazism and Zionism. But going back to these stepping stones, These were crucial events, seemingly, to get us to where we are right now with these other unfolding operations.
Yeah, 100%. So yes, that's another major element is Zionism itself. So the state of Israel, whilst certainly entrenched and disguised in kind of religious conviction in this noble pursuit, it is just as virulent as the rest. It's just another offshoot, another subsidiary of kind of this elitist establishment in the pursuit for global governance. So very few people know this. It's which is quite shocking, but I'm sure over the years it's going to start to emerge. But even within the Zionist state of Israel, there was a strong ideology of eugenics. There was a guy by the name of Arthur Rupin specifically, and Arthur Rupin was a German Jew, but he was a eugenist, and he viewed Ashkenazi Jews. So you get three different distinctions. You get Ashkenazis, which are more European, Western European. Then you get Mizrahi, which is more, they come from the Arabian countries. And then you get Sephardic Jews, which are from Spain and Portugal and kind of the Mediterranean area. He viewed this project in Palestine as being one about Ashkenazi supremacy, and that's very interesting. He controlled so many aspects. He's very little known, but he's actually recognized as the father of Zionist settlement. And there's all kinds of other forces, most notably the Rothschild family, in all of that. But it was certainly established as a geopolitical maneuver on one end, and then ideologically speaking, a kind of eugenic enterprise on the other. So during this time emerged the concept of muscular Judaism, which is a new Jew. You can go look up a guy by the name of Max Nordau, Nordau, Max Nordau. And he propounded this concept, and they were actually virulently anti-Semitic, the leading Zionists. They didn't like how Jews were. They considered them to be thrifty, like all of these legitimate anti-Semitic stereotypes. They were propounding them in a massive way. And instead they said, look, we need to create a new Jew. And this was then taken up by other people such as Vladimir Zahev Jabotinsky, who was a genuine fascist. He's the most commemorated figure in Israeli history. He's the father of something called revisionist Zionism, which is better known today as the concept of a greater Israel, where the borders are constantly expanding. And so he took this up, and his view was, okay, well, we have to become profoundly militant. And this has been personified in the modern day Israel, compulsory and mandatory militarism and serving in the military, and just this very warped ideology that they have. And I suppose I've done other podcasts so people can specifically check that out. But in relation to it being used as a wider tool and proverbial weapon in the globalist establishment, one of the biggest giveaways is in the wake of World War II. They also actually work with the Nazis. So there's a very famous assassin. He was one of Hitler's favorite assassins. His name was Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny, he actually parachuted and rescued Mussolini. Well, the Mossad employed Otto Skorzeny. They also employed a guy by the name of Walter Rauff. Walter Rauff was known as the architect of the mobile gas chamber, and he's been credited with I don't know, killing like 100,000 people or something, but they had no problem with working with him. Then, subsequent and corresponding to that further, in South America, where a lot of the Nazis ended up migrating through the proverbial rat lines, which was actually facilitated by another Council on Foreign Relations member and the founder of the MK Ultra program, Alan Dulles, of the Dulles brothers. They were also very prominent in fueling and funding Hitler and Nazi Germany. All of these backdoor deals largely done through Sullivan and Cromwell. Very interesting organization to look into in relation to globalism at large. And so what happened when these individuals went to South America is they began to serve in the wider program of Operation Condor and these South American dictatorships, the so-called dirty wars, and when horrible atrocities were committed, and there were internment camps and there were exterminations. And this is also, people may be a bit more familiar in relation to Ronald Reagan's surreptitious patronage of the Contra War. This was all part of that kind of a scheme, right? There was Battalion 316, in which they implemented MK Ultra strategies. They were in fact trained by the Central Intelligence Agency, all of these different death squads. The thing is, when they had problems, right? So the US government or these more conspicuous governments of funding or arming these military groups that in fact had Nazis working for them. So Klaus Barbie, for example, the butcher of Lyon, he was in fact uh, used as an asset and an intelligence asset to guide the death squads, right? And so were other infamous Nazi figures. I think Walter Roth, if I recall correctly, was one of them. So this wasn't happening just in Operation Paperclip, is what I'm saying, in the US. And so when they couldn't do this overtly and they had to do it covertly, guess who filled in the gap and started to go ahead and provide these dictatorships with the funding and the weaponry and the military equipment they needed to carry out these exterminations, which, by the way, in Argentina included actually targeting Jewish communities. It was the state of Israel. So it's a very Machiavellian state, is what I'm saying, and it serves just this kind of greater game where there's an agenda that extends beyond justice, far beyond justice, and it's about personal control, it's about population control, and so on and so forth. And then just where this kind of fits into the greater game and the greater scheme of everything, and in modern day events and the potential for a global conflict, that's definitely the writing is on the wall there. And I kind of veer and I'm inclined towards the perspective of George Orwell, is that these very theatrical wars that break out, they're not necessarily genuine conflicts between one parasitical ruling class against another, but rather it's theatrical where they have a mutual interest of maintaining control over their citizenry, over their common people.
Yes.
Something that a lot of people overlook in the publication of 1984 is that it was, people can quote it, all of these kind of generalized quotes, these famous quotes, but few people realize the deeper message in which he was trying to inculcate. And it's very interesting to me because he wrote this in the wake of World War II, which it makes me suspect that he may have been somewhat knowledgeable about what happened in World War II, because that's precisely what it was, with the absolving of Nazi war criminals and this horrible war in which so many common people, regular people, end up paying with their lives and dying, thinking that they're fighting for justice, when in reality, what's transpiring, what's taking place, is not only either a preservation of the status quo, which is what he would talk about. They fight to preserve the status quo, which is their own personal power. And we see this also manifesting in the Russian and Ukrainian war, where the ruling class are not the ones taking the brunt of it, it's the common people. But not only is that on the one end, but historically, the consolidation of power and the consolidation of more centralized global governance has been facilitated by conflict. That's precisely what happened with World War II and utilizing Nazi Germany as the excuse. And in the more modern sense, the new enemy, it was COVID-19, this intangible virus that's everywhere. And of course, now through that globalist creation, the World Health Organization, they're once again going for a unprecedented power grab under the banner and disguise of protecting health.
You mentioned MK Ultra, psychological operations. Seems like these experiments cover such huge areas of what we are now experiencing as well, even within realms of our technology, our society, that this era of quote-unquote MK Ultra mind control experimentation was information gathering for control of the masses, which they are now attempting to really roll out into full force, it seems.
Oh, 100%. So it's so important to understand also the history of social engineering, because again, the Rockefeller family has played a pivotal role. Yeah, they have been actually revolutionary in the field of social science, and that's just an academic term for actual social engineering. So they took very early interest in my publication. I actually kind of go down a list of some of the most pivotal figures that they financed in their research, which includes people like Ivan Pavlov, the guy who kind of invented the concept of classical conditioning, which this was done first through his observation of how dogs would salivate when they would see his assistant who was tasked with feeding them. So the food wasn't actually there, but just by seeing her, they would salivate. This is classical conditioning, where if you do something and it's associated with something very strong, so in an emotional stimuli, or in the dog's case, a more primordial, which is food, then that association gradually becomes unconscious. And to help further extract that specific understanding, because it's absolutely relevant and pertinent to every form of classical conditioning and virtually every form of brainwashing that goes on today, there was a student of Ivan Pavlov, which was also financed and funded by the Rockefeller Network. And this was a guy by the name of John Watson. And John Watson engaged in an experiment known as the Little Albert experiment. And what this was is they took a baby that was just a few months old, couldn't even walk. And so he thought, let me see if I can apply this methodology of manipulating the associative memory, of engaging in classical conditioning against an infant, against a human being. And so what he did is he would present this baby with different stimuli, right? Stimulation in the form of a burning newspaper, a mouse, a a book, and then he would tabulate kind of the observations he made. How is the baby reacting to this? And so the baby was mostly neutral, but in certain instances, such as with the mouse, the baby was actually interested and wanted to play with the mouse. So after this initial first round of making these observations, the second round, he would actually hide in the background, and then his assistant would give the mouse to the little baby, and he wanted to see if he could make a horrible, excruciating sound in the background with a piece of iron every time the baby tried to play with the mouse. Could that potentially result in some form of classical conditioning? Because one of the things is very loud, inexplicable sounds innately. It's one of the few things that can actually inculcate some form of fear. And so he was indeed right. Every time the baby would try to play with the mouse, he started to classically condition and unconsciously associate this horrible sound with the mouse, until eventually, in the third round, he could give the mouse to the baby. And just by seeing the mouse alone, the baby would hysterically cry and act totally frantic.
Mm.
And this form of conditioning is, in fact, embedded within every form of society. So, in the modern day state of Zionist Israel, they unconsciously associate the Palestinians with the Nazis. It's something highly evocative. And if you put the two together enough, this also happened with the Bush administration and the so called war on terror, where they constantly associated Saddam Hussein with Al Qaeda and 9/11, and you kind of ball it all together. That's classical conditioning. On the same level, forms of advertising in films where there is product placement, it's the same concept. This is why they hired Sylvester Stallone to sell cigarettes. This is why Spider-Man is on a cereal. Underlying that is a strong unconscious emotion, and naturally it makes the impulse where, oh, I want to be like Sylvester Stallone, and I'm going to smoke cigarettes, because it's an unconscious association. It's the same as a child sees Spider-Man. Oh, that's strong emotional and very evocative. And so this is classical conditioning. So that's just one element of many in which the Rockefeller Network very closely studied the power of social engineering. So what it really did is it took kind of this concept of the art of war from Sun Tzu 2,300 years ago, and it refined it, and it turned it into a sort of science, very meticulous. And if you go through some of the research that they've done and they've engaged in, they are fully aware of how fear can be weaponized to literally murder people. They understand how to engage in conflict. There was the I think it was the Robbers Cave experiment, if I recall correctly, which was an experiment in how you could get two sides to engage in a conflict that you actually create, and then through creating a some kind of an emergency, you can get them to unify and you can guide them in the direction that you want them to go in. And so they really very well understood this. And so part of the publication in which I write is first the great insights into social engineering. And then the other aspect is how they also played a pivotal influence in the MK Ultra program. So the MK Ultra program was not just simply about mind control, it was unprecedented mind control, but also biowarfare and various forms of population control. And I outlined some of the most egregious experiments, mind-blowing things, where they, for example, one of the practitioners, he was capable of indoctrinating a atheist to become a devout believer and then turning him back over. They were able to turn a woman who had a fear of guns into a hypothetical assassin, where she pulled the trigger and she expressed complete amnesia within seconds of the event taking
Jeez.
place. And just other forms of events like that transpiring.
Yeah.
The Rockefeller Network, once again, played a seminal influence in this. And at the time, although it's not recognized because this is something that's very much covered up to this very day, the MK Ultra program was in fact the greatest project up until that time in human history to study occult measures of population control. In fact, they had projects that studied Satanism, that studied witchcraft. They studied everything. There was no stone left unturned. And then in the midst of all of that, if you really dig deeply in and you look at, let's say, an event like Sirhan's assassination of RFK, the alleged lone gunman, well, first of all, the forensic evidence, all the eyewitness testimony, everything shows that it was absolutely implausible. And both the defense and the prosecution, the psychiatrist, have established that he, in fact, was hypnotized. And of course, it wasn't well known at the time that they could literally create mind controlled assassins. But if you look at when they did produce these results, it coincides with all of these high profile assassinations of different political leaders, MLK, RFK, JFK, and so on and so forth, Medgar Evers. Then you start to see the hidden hand. And if you dig much deeper, of course, this takes lots of legwork. That's what you come away with. Now, the significance is in the publication, I then established all these different correspondences that were studied originally in the MK Ultra or under the MK Ultra umbrella. So there's many subsidiary projects, but just to keep it simple, the MK Ultra project, and how this in fact manifested during the so-called pandemic. And it was clearly weaponized against the people, which is weaponizing fear, which is forcing people into social isolation, right? Social distancing, a very Orwellian term, and monopolizing their perception of reality. Everybody was on their phone. If you recall that time, I know it seems like an alternative reality, but everybody will be standing in line, got their face masks, which, by the way, is why they use that in Guantanamo Bay, which is infamous for its MK Ultra tactics. It's a form of sensory deprivation. It's very minor, but
Mm-hmm.
it's significant nonetheless if you look at the social engineering literature. And everybody's separated, but what are they doing? They're looking at the phone. Now we know that Facebook, we know that Twitter, we know that the most popular websites in the world were being heavily, heavily manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were monopolizing people's perceptions. And this, amongst many other tactics, were implemented. And yes, it was for the purpose of engaging on an unprecedented social engineering project on the one hand, but as I also detail in the publication, with the emergence of new technologies in the form of nanotechnology specifically and other forms of biowarfare, what I view, and I further expressed this point by drawing on the correspondences. For example, in MK Ultra, the excuse was, "Oh, we engaged in the Cold War. Oh, we have to engage in this underhanded research, these biological warfare researches, the social engineering of the population, because that's who it was targeted against, and Nazi scientists were involved in that as well. It was done under the umbrella of, oh, we've got to do this, or the Soviets are going to do this." Of course, now another thing I mentioned in the publication is communist Russia was itself built up by the exact same network technologically and militarily as that which built up Nazi Germany. So the Council on Foreign Relations, again, just another proverbial chess move on the board where they are controlling all the sides. Because the best way to control the outcome of a conflict is to control the conflict on one level or another. And then now the same thing is going on today, where you have a guy like Professor James Giordano. He's a high profile contractor for DARPA. He's a neuroscientist and he specializes in neuro warfare, where he's going across military academies around the world and he's basically saying to them, look, if we don't engage in some of these underhanded programs and these projects and these new programs of nanotechnology, weaponizing it, and so on and so forth, then we're going to fall behind with China. Then we're going to fall behind with Russia. And of course, what I found in the midst of all of that is where he's also been sponsored by the Rockefeller Network. The Rockefeller Network and the Gates Foundation and all of these elitist factions are likewise sponsoring the nano warfare technologies being produced on the Russian side, on the Chinese side. And the significance of this, before again I pass the mic over, is that by creating these artificial conflicts, and then you can weaponize and get the best and most brilliant scientific minds to research biowarfare, to research population control, to research nanowarfare, and then to go a step further, lower their moral compasses and engage in these things, what you do then is you further your grip, your monopolization, your control on how best you can control the rest of society at large. And so what I see taking place in the modern sense is MK Ultra literally on steroids.
Going back to these biowarfare experiments that are being conducted on people as we speak, there is a bright side, if you will, to it. We still have free will. We have to opt into a lot of these dangerous experiments. We have to allow them to inject us with things. We have to participate with certain things. So a lot of these experiments does depend on our free will. And I see a lot of good things happening with people waking up and not participating, which I want to get to as well. But tell us a little bit about some of these things that we need to be aware of that are being rolled out technologically as these biological experiments.
Yeah, 100%. So I like the fact that you mentioned that. I think it's always healthy as well for anybody that is listening to this that we end the podcast on a positive note, because I want to make it unequivocally, unambiguously clear, in spite of everything that I'm saying, guys, I am eternally optimistic. And I believe that, first and foremost, the reason why we are becoming aware of these projects, which is difficult, right? Disillusionment is a very difficult process, but it always precedes enlightenment and creating positive change on the individual and on the collective. The reason why I see us becoming aware of this is because the information revolution, as facilitated by the internet, has changed the game indefinitely. I don't think of the parasite class as being kind of omnipotent and all powerful. They may have played that role largely in the past. I see more so than anything else is that they are in a reactive position and they can no longer contend with the millions and millions of people that are awakening all around the world. So, yes, we'll definitely touch on some of that before we conclude the podcast. In relation to some of the technologies, though, that are available, the first thing I think that's really important for me is to always establish some kind of an historical foundation before exploring any potentialities. And the reason why I say this is then you have some kind of truth from which you can draw, right? History repeats itself, or as Mark Twain would say, it may not repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? Back in the day, again, under the umbrella of the so-called Cold War during the or I think starting in 1950, maybe in the late 1940s, but I give a series of detailed examples, again, in my publication, from 1950 through to the mid-1970s that we know about, where we have quite a great deal of detail on. Literally millions of people all throughout the continental US, into Canada, into England, and worldwide. We don't even know about all the statistics, but millions and millions and millions of people were sprayed with harmful bacteria, harmful chemicals, and the outcome of these people was never actually monitored. So there were some assiduous scientists that, for example, in one project it was known as Operation Sea Spray. This was in San Francisco, where they blanketed the population in a bacteria called Serratia marcescens. They never monitored anybody, but fortunately there were some vigilant people within the medical establishment, and they in fact published their observations and their research that there is an outbreak of Serratia marcescens. Now, this was mind-blowing because there had never been a recorded outbreak of Serratia marcescens in the US. And nonetheless, they were capable of ascertaining this, and then within, I think it was 2 decades, it became basically epidemic across the US and a serious cause of infection. And in fact, that test resulted in 12 hospitalizations and 1 death. Yeah, which is mind-blowing. And even though the military became aware of this, they bizarrely and insanely said, oh, it's coincidental. So it's never ever been recorded in history, Serratia marcescens outbreak. It gets recorded now, and they say that it's a coincidence, and they continue spraying all different parts of the US rather than ending the program right then and there. Mind-blowing. But so the significance of this is that, yes, they are willing to do this. They will engage in these massive experiments. They will also later on try to cover it up and claim, oh, the scientific literature. Because if you look it up now, it's going to continue where they say, oh, these were innocuous levels of these chemicals and these bacteria. But if you look at the biowarfare specialists Professor Leonard Cole, he's passed away now, but he has completely refuted this in a very powerful and brilliant way. Again, not a controversial authority to decide. In fact, he would advise the government in some capacity on many occasions. So, world-renowned expert. He passed away, but just to quickly address that, in the modern sense, there are unprecedented technologies that are being rolled out. So, one thing that is the wet dream for eugenists is the CRISPR gene editing technology. Because if you look at Francis Galton's work, his whole thing is that he wanted to eliminate the process of natural selection and instead give that to the social engineers, where you can produce the genes that you want and delete the genes you do not want. The significance of this is that CRISPR editing, this gene technology, that's what it's about. It's about eliminating the concept of natural selection and instead giving this power to the social engineers, to the scientists, so that they can create the kind of human that they want. Of course, what's emerging slowly now as well is transhumanism, which was in fact popularized, the term, and coined by Julian Huxley, who was a lifelong fellow of the British Eugenics Society and one of the founding members of the World Wildlife Fund. And he was also the brother of Aldous Huxley, the guy who wrote Brave New World, because he was actually drawing more so from his mind and his awareness of being a member of the Huxley family rather than his imagination. And so nanotechnology is something that is imperceptible, which is very disturbing. You can't even see it. And so through nanotechnology, and I list some of the more mainstream examples that are in the public domain, significance obviously being what they have in the private domain exceeds that of the public domain. But the projects that they have put forward in the public domain show that they have essentially honed the capability where they can inject anywhere on site. So it used to be it had to be specifically to relegated to a location, but now they can inject you in the arm, and they can have this nanomaterial go to anywhere in your body. And within the lipids, the nanolipids, they can use parasites, they can use little nanobots that can interrupt your emotional regulation, your hormone regulation. The significance being, you can interrupt hormone regulation, you can interrupt moods. And then, of course, essentially, to keep it short and sweet, nanotechnology can be used to kind of insert anything into your body. So pharmaceuticals, drugs, parasites, and all of these examples that I'm giving, including parasites, are things that they, in fact, are exploring as weaponizing. Just as during the MK Ultra project, they were weaponizing mosquitoes, they were weaponizing lice, which there's a lot of interesting research that suggests the Lyme epidemic, in fact, was rooted in this unethical research. And again, another Nazi that was involved in this kind of research. But in terms of what's going on and some of the applications, I would refer people to the book specifically. It is disturbing again, but this is yet a continuation of this kind of struggle that goes on for even longer than history records between agents of deception and elitism and agents of truth and humanity. And I do believe we'll win.
I do too, and I believe we've allowed too much for too long. We've participated with too many of their nefarious agendas. We've participated with too many of their elections, poisonous food and products, and it's time that we start to take it all back. And I see a lot of people that I never would have thought before that are becoming aware of some of these things. It is, in a way, thanks to the events of 2020 and everything that's happened afterwards. So we're in a very interesting time in our history with a lot of things happening at the same time, and I think it's a very pivotal point for us, possibly to swoop in and take over some of these systems that were corrupted from the foundation and rotten and ready to come down. So how do you feel about where we're at right now?
I think we're just undergoing a very difficult transition. It's kind of analogous to the caterpillar first undergoing the very complex, painful hardship of undergoing the chrysalis and then turning into a proverbial butterfly. Not to be too corny or too cliche, but for me, the micro and the macro, they correspond. And what I mean by that is, for example, earlier I was talking about my own personal journey, where, man, I felt suicidal. I was deeply depressed. Not to say that I never feel heavy emotions anymore, because to be deeply empathic and compassionate, which tends to precede one's interest in trying to help humanity as a collective, you can still feel these deep and heavy emotions. But obviously, you know how to regulate them, you know how to deal with them, you have some balance, because you can't always be entrenched in the absolute toxicity that is the parasite and deception
Mm.
clause. But there is this difficult process where you come to a place and you recognize that the pain of remaining the same is actually more than the pain required to change. And so naturally, now we're going through a process of very difficult disillusionment where we recognize we are faced with an ultimatum. Either we have to acquiesce and bow down to this parasite clause, or we need to rise up as a collective humanity, recognizing we are many and they are few, and taking our rightful place as people, as individuals, as a human family that have just as much a right to this beautiful planet as they do. And rather than acquiescing and giving into a world of elitism, of parasitism, of exploitation, of deception, we now are faced with a position where our input, our capability to unify can create a world of humanitarianism, a world where truth triumphs over deception, where the more noble principles and pursuits of humanity can take prioritization. And I see this just snowballing, man. You know, even my capability as somebody coming from, like, I got kicked out of high school. I'm a former felon. I come from the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. There's no way that I would have ever been able to engage in this level of self education and self emancipation had it not been for the revolutionary advent of the internet. I've met some remarkable people. We've taken a quantum leap collectively, which has been true throughout history, even with the printing press. Whenever there's an information revolution, it is succeeded by a physical revolution. But what makes this one so significantly different than any other in the past is we are in a position where we can actually facilitate the first true, genuine revolution on an international, global, unified scale, which is an internal revolution of the mind.
Yes.
So I'm very optimistic. I believe that as we exchange our information, as more and more human beings begin to engage in the process of being a creative being rather than a reactive being to the system, and we start to produce a creation that coincides with our greater values rather than exclusively feeling disempowered and reacting to their toxic creation. Um, it's a matter of when, not a matter of if. And these things are in fact happening in real time. People are building off-grid
Mm.
communities. People are coming up with decentralized alternatives. And in fact, again, as I said earlier, I believe a lot of what they're doing is
Mm-hmm.
reactive. So their reaction to decentralized currencies was centralized currencies. Their reaction to the information revolution was a counter information revolution in the form of censorship. And so they're just naturally in a position of reactivity, and that is not a empowering position. So I think we oftentimes give them too much credit. And whilst I don't think we should underestimate our enemy in any way, shape, or form, it's good to have a healthy respect, not an admiration, but respect for them. We need to also start to step into and recognize and fully embody our personal power as individuals and as a collective
Mm.
humanity.
In this technological age, we are definitely experiencing, like you said, digital warfare. And it's so interesting that folks like you and me are on the front lines of this new war that we're experiencing right now. And like I said earlier, I think now is our time to take it over, because it's easy. Once you get into a flow, it's easy to become a step or two or 10 ahead of these nefarious lizard people and become ahead of the game. So I think everyone has the capability to do that
100%.
100%.
Yeah, know your enemy, man. I mean, this is one of the basic tenets of the art of war, which is why I also put that publication together, because it's really supposed to be an instructional manual for people to gain insight as to how these individuals and these families, how they work. Because when you become aware of, let's say, I was talking about classical conditioning earlier, I see that shit surrounding me 24/7. And so I am impenetrable. I'm invulnerable to its influence. because I can see it from a mile away. Whereas, unfortunately, other people, they cannot see this. So, one of the examples personified through the so-called pandemic, as it relates to classical conditioning, is we saw how people can be so incensed collectively on an unconscious, irrational, emotional level to let's throw these people in prison. If they go to hospital, let's not give them treatment. And this was the very underhanded gaslighting methodology of the psychopath class and the parasite class, in which they constantly associated people that were questioning the lockdown as being somehow underhanded and evil and so on and so forth. But if you are aware, if you have studied their methodologies, then you are largely invulnerable to their influences. Now, again, I have a healthy awareness and a healthy respect for the fact that they have occult knowledge. There may be certain things that can still transcend my awareness of it. But I promise you that once you have the foundational understandings, then you can protect yourself accordingly. And you can also engage in this information warfare skillfully by utilizing the weaponry of truth against the weaponry of deception.
I love it, man. That is a wonderful note to close on. Gavin, thank you so much. This is fantastic information. Before you go, remind everyone how they can get the book and find out more about you.
So ironically, the book, I try to spread it as far and as wide as I possibly could, but it was censored very quickly. I never ever got much feedback on that. I was just kind of threatened. But it is ironically on Amazon. So you can find it on Amazon. People can also reach out to me directly, but unfortunately, I only have the ebook in PDF format, which is ideal for a larger reading format, which is to say a laptop or a bigger notebook reading thing. And it is cool. It's very well put out. I give a meticulous section of sources and citation. And again, it's very instructive for those who are genuinely a student of trying to know their enemy. Beyond that, where people can reach me, I try to guide as many people towards my Patreon as possible, because for as little as just $1 a month, you can help to fund what is original research, and I am relentless in my pursuits. And with the further advantage and the understanding of recognizing, much as people who were at the forefront and were a bit more precognitive, a bit more perceptive about the changing of the times in the not so distant past, where they recognized that the local organic farmer needs your support. Otherwise, they will be bulldozed over by this surreptitious system, which needs to feed you unhealthy foods that will debilitate you. So is true with independent journalists, independent researchers, independent historians, independent truth warriors. They want to give you organic knowledge that will empower you, rather than have the superficial kind of bullshit information that is meant to debilitate people. So please, guys, you can also sign up for free over there, but I would appreciate some kind of financial support, which is heavily encouraging. It's not just helpful in the long run to continue doing this, but it's also inspiring that people are willing to really and truly get behind you. And it's also given me a respect as somebody that has been a target of censorship since way back in the day, even before it became a popular thing with the so-called pandemic. It's given me a totally new appreciation for supporters, for followers, and the recognition that there can be no voice of truth. There can be no great research done unless there is a silent and quiet and humble but powerful support system behind them. So to those who are engaged in such things on your end and my end, I have the greatest deal of respect for you, and we could never do this without you.
Very well said, my friend. Thank you so much, Gavin. I'd love to definitely talk to you again in the future. There's so much more we can cover. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. We'll see y'all then.